We need to talk because we've been learning about conservatism now for, I don't know, 4 or 5 videos. And yet, what we've learned about conservatism doesn't necessarily really match up to the reality of what is happening in the Conservative Party for over the last, say, 30 to 40 years. Basically, kind of Thatcher plus. And the reason for this is that conservatism undergoes a major transformation towards the end of the 70s and into the early 80s. And since that, and this is known as the New Right. And what we're going to be doing in this video is exploring what this phrase, the New Right, means, why it occurs, what the policies and the beliefs are, and to what extent the kind of the Conservative Party throughout the kind of the 2000s and the noughties and the nows is still a New Right party, or whether it has gone back to kind of one nation and traditional policies of conservatism. So that's our goals, and let's get started. So here she is. Perhaps the biggest kind of icon of the New Right in the UK is Margaret Thatcher, and in America it's probably Ronald Reagan. But of course, Thatcher was not the thinker, the instigator, the kind of the author behind the ideas of the New Right. She, in fact, was the politician that kind of agreed and then implemented those ideas. So unlike Disraeli, who we can probably say is our thinker behind the one nation conservatism, it is other thinkers that we're going to be bringing in when we discuss the New Right. But what exactly is the New Right? And it's weird because it's actually a hybrid of two different ideologies that have kind of been kind of shoved together. Let me just shrink myself down a little bit. There we are. Now, it has two halves. The first half is neoliberalism. Neo means kind of like new or modern. So this is like a new version of liberalism that is then kind of bolted into a form of modern conservatism, because the other half of the New Right is neoconservatism. So the New Right is shorthand for taking two perhaps contradictory ideologies and kind of bolting them together. Now, how does this happen, and why does this happen? And like all ideologies and all thinkers, it's so important to look at the context and the time period in which this happens. Now, let's just think about the 1960s and 70s. We've had what's become known as kind of a Keynesian, or I heard an unusual pronunciation the other day, which was Keynesian economics, the post-war consensus from about 1945 to about 1980, which is a form of managing the economy where the government does actually manage the economy, where the government gets involved. They'll perhaps support businesses which are failing to protect jobs. They will invest and have in the economy to kind of provide infrastructure. They will have a mixed economy, which is where you have a mixture of public and private enterprises. So, for example, they had publicly owned, that means owned by the government, energy services and transport services and NHS and postal services, and there's probably other things as well. But this post-war consensus was that the government plays a big role in the economy, both by intervening in it and by actually owning huge chunks of it. And by the time you get to the late 70s, it wasn't working. You had famously the winter of discontent, and if you don't know what that is, go look it up. I've got some video clips that I can share with you in class. You had famously the winter of discontent, where the dead lay unburied and the rubbish lay uncollected, because there was so much economic misery. You'd had the 3-day week, which was where Edward Heath had to close factories for 2 days out of 5 because there just wasn't enough power. And the big cause for this was stagflation, which the economics students amongst you will know. It's where you get high inflation and high unemployment at the same time, which is basically the kiss of death for any kind of economy, because you normally have one or the other, and one will balance out the other. But if you have both at the same time, you're just kind of tanking. So there had become an acceptance in some. No, I'll rephrase that. Some radicals had started to propose that Keynesian economics, this post-war consensus of intervening in the economy, was not working. And these radicals included people like Milton Friedman, and there's another one whose name escapes me right now. And they started to propose an economic version of classic liberalism, which is why you kind of get this, which is that the government really needed to step back, and that the government needed to, if a business was no longer economically viable and it was going to lose jobs if it closed, then it was no longer economically viable and it was going to lose jobs when it closed. And all of these things that were owned by the state, like the transport, it was just no longer. It was taking away from innovation and efficiency, and it was bad. So these kind of radical thinkers, these perhaps ideological thinkers, and I'm using these words deliberately to see where I'm going here, were proposing a massive revamp to the economy and to the nation in both America and in England. Let's pause. The other thing that had taken place in the 1960s and the 70s was a huge social liberalization. Homosexuality had been legalized. Abortion had been legalized. The death penalty had been abolished. Society was becoming a lot more permissive. Think like Woodstock festivals, free love, hippies. Contraception was now more widely available, and traditional family values of one woman, one man, nuclear family, and traditional structures in society had changed. I'm not going to use phrases like broken down because that sounds like an emotive phrase, but if we can just kind of acknowledge that society and values, traditional values, had changed. These days, most of us would probably argue this had been a good thing and this was just society progressing. But let's just acknowledge that there has been change. And whenever you get change, you get an issue that some people are kind of for that change and other people are against that change. So what you get is a scenario where you get, and of course you know from conservatives now that they value tradition and they value pragmatism and they value the kind of historical institutions that a country and a society has. So what you get here is a situation where you get a group of people that are saying we have to overhaul the economy. And then the same group of people are also saying, and we have to restore ourselves to traditional values and kind of crack down on this kind of permissive behavior. And somehow this then becomes merged into what we call the new right. So in short, the new right is a free market approach to economics with a traditional approach to family values and society. And when you kind of look at this, you might kind of well think, well, hang on, isn't this a contradiction? On one side, you're saying, I want as much freedom as possible. But on the other side, you're saying, I want an authoritarian state that's actually going to kind of crack down a bit on kind of social freedoms. And yeah, it kind of is a contradiction. But again, look at it within the context in which it came up. It was a reaction against what was actually happening in the country. So let's kind of flesh this out a little bit, and you can probably kind of take some notes. You might want to kind of pause the video there and start to talk about, take some suggestions. But I'm going to kind of summarize what I've just kind of said into a few bullet points here. So the new right is a radical response to the failing 70s economies and 60s social permissiveness. And the reason why, again, this is quite an unusual step for conservatism to take is because, especially on the neoliberal side, it's ideological. It's about individualism. It's about believing abstractly that we can improve the economy by if only we did this, only we did that. And so in many ways, the new right is not conservative in the way that it had been traditionally understood. And if you think about Michael Oakeshott with his if you think about Burke with his changing to conserve thing, or just keeping the boat afloat, this suddenly feels like we've got a destination that we're heading to. However, the counter argument is the country wasn't working. Literally, in many cases, unemployment was bad. So the argument here is perhaps this is simply just changing to conserve, just with quite a major shift to change to conserve. So the new right combines neoliberalism, modern liberalism, and neoconservatism. I'll just pause there for a second. Both of the key thinkers that we're going to be learning about in this video are on the neoliberal side. So when you're kind of looking at the thinkers and kind of, yeah, but where's the neoconservative side and what they're saying? It's not really there, to be honest. It was that the conservative movement as a whole combined these two things, but the two thinkers that we're looking at are definitely kind of neoliberal thinkers, really. It often appears to be a contradiction to itself, although I'm sure they would perhaps disagree. And if we're going to summarize it in a sentence, perhaps it's something like this. It's individualism and free markets, neoliberal, combined with traditional social values and law and order, neoconservative. And the two thinkers that we're going to be learning about are Ayn Rand and Robert Nozick. Going to be the two. I'm going to try and hopefully get all of that into this video without making it too long. So what does this mean for the state? So we've already, in one of the previous videos, I've already got a description of conservative state, conservative society. But what does this actually mean? Because under this version of a state, under the new right version of the state, it is a minimal state that is purely there to enforce order again. It's almost a step back more to the kind of traditional conservative view. But in realistically, that looks more like the classic liberal view, doesn't it? We're taking away Disraeli's paternalism and the palace is not happy if the palace is not safe if the cottage is not happy, and we're going back to freedom, 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 freedom. It's going to guard negative freedom, not positive freedom. And I read a really good description the other day about negative freedom and positive freedom, because it actually relates to the state. With negative freedom or negative liberty, the state takes away any barriers to you being able to do something. Under positive freedom, the state will help you to do something. And the neoliberal, new right version of this is definitely negative freedom. They're not going to stop you from doing anything. In fact, they're going to take away barriers from you doing things. But they're not necessarily going to help you to do it, because that would be the modern liberal interventionist approach. This is about allowing you as an individual to kind of carve your way out using your own skills and whatever. Welfare is, excuse me, my voice just went weird there. Welfare is the responsibility of the individual. Now, Thatcher never touched the NHS. It was one of the few things she didn't try to privatize. But as you might know, America has a very different kind of health and welfare system. But she did kind of scale back in many other areas. And please don't think in any way that I'm passing a judgment of this is good or this is bad. I'm just kind of calling the different approaches to kind of welfare. Is it a collective thing or is it an individual thing? This is an ideological choice rather than necessarily right or wrong. You can add on the right and the wrong as is your own views. Many of them argued that tax infringes liberty, and you're going to see this with our key thinkers. As I work for however many hours, and then the government just takes a bunch of my money. It infringes on my liberty. It takes away from, stealing. One of our key thinkers is actually going to say, and some of them argued that it even creates a dependency culture. If you have a system whereby if I don't work or I'm unable to work or I don't try my hardest, then the government will give me kind of handouts. This creates a dependency culture where I will just live dependent on the government rather than dependent on myself. Which is opening up a huge can of worms, because the whole kind of like benefits debate, universal credit debate is a huge one, and it'd be an awesome one to kind of have in class. To what extent are benefits necessary and part of human rights, and to what extent do they create a dependency culture? It's a very passionate debate, and if you get the wrong person on the wrong day on these kind of things, you'll be in for a fight. But there are two sides to this, and there are cases on both sides where you can look at a person and can say, oh my God, the state definitely needs to help that person, and other state cases where you can look and kind of say, well, actually, this person is way too dependent on the state and they're just not helping themselves. Both of those cases are probably true. So what policy do you put in place? And Ronald Reagan famously once said, government is, or I might paraphrase this, government is not the solution to our problems. government is the problem. I think he might have said when people ask me what can the government do about our problems, and I tell them government is the problem. And the point he's making there is that he was saying that the problem is the government is doing too much. The government is intervening too much. The government is interfering in people's lives, people's businesses, the economy too much. And he was saying the government is the problem. Pull back, let the market guide itself. At the Adam Smith kind of view or laissez-faire style of economics, talks about the idea that the invisible hand of free market economics, that the economy will guide itself, which has held a lot of truth until maybe the 2008 financial crash, where a lot of people have kind of said, well, is there really an invisible guiding hand? But that's an economics question, not a political one. So there's the new right state, looking far more like classic liberalism than perhaps what we saw with traditional and one nation conservatism. And here's Ayn Rand. Now, she is a Russian American. I believe she was born in Russia and then ends up living and writing in America. And she is an author of fiction books, and they're called Atlas Rising and Fountainhead. And both books have characters and heroes who succeed ultimately by realizing that it is their duty to themselves rather than their duty to their others, which is the correct way forward. And some politicians have said that they found her books life-changing, because one of her big threads and core ideas is something called Objectivism, which is the idea that you are responsible for you, and your biggest priority should be you, and you should aim almost exclusively at your own happiness and benefit. Now, she's not saying exploit others. She's not saying harm others. She's not saying do things which actively go about causing problems for other people. She's 100%, she's not saying that. But what she is saying is that your biggest duty is to yourself. And that she believes that society will be better if people look out for themselves more than they look out for the collective. So it's almost the polar opposite to what you might see in something like socialism. And so she would look at an idea like modern liberalism, where it's about kind of enabling each other, and would say, no, there is no duty to one another here. It is purely about what you want to do. Now, of course, I've been watching some videos and reading up about her. She has no problem with charity at all. You know, if you see a person on the street and you want to give them £10, if you have a friend that needs help with healthcare and you want to go and support them, of course you can. She is 100% behind you. But what she is saying is that there should be no expectation and no duty and no feeling that you have to do this, that you have a responsibility to do this, because your responsibility is, as she says, to yourself. And that is Objectivism. And she believes in a society based around atomism, which is the opposite of a collective. You know, if you know your kind of science about atoms, and I don't, it's the idea that all of these atoms are kind of separate and independent, living apart from each other, and then they are in a society as a whole, but they are independently kind of bouncing around. And that's what she believes society is, a collection of individuals, individualism. I mean, you could feel the liberalism here, rather than an organic society, that kind of approach to living. And she believes in rational self-realization and fulfillment. You know, so again, we've got rationalism coming up, all the core liberal value. This is why this is neoliberalism, and this is why it's so strange to see in the conservative movement all of these liberal ideas, because you go back to John Hobbes, and Hobbes is saying, human beings can't improve themselves, they suck, life is nasty, brutish and short, we live in a state of perpetual war, blah 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 blah. And then we've got this new thread of conservative new right coming along and saying, no, humans can be rational, they can carve out their own destiny, they can be fulfilled in a meritocracy. So this is a flip within conservatism, which we shouldn't kind of underestimate. And she loathes the organic society, as she says that the obligation erodes your freedoms by forcing me or you to pay into a collective pot through taxation, which is then redistributed out. It is removing my freedoms, and perhaps even harming the people that are the beneficiaries of it, because it's causing them to be dependent rather than causing them to be able to maintain their lives through their own efforts. That was actually a little bit smoother than I intended it to be, but the right bubble came up at the right time. So she's a big believer in it's up to you, it's your responsibility. Think back to liberalism, meritocracy. This is what's coming out through the workings of Ayn Rand. If you're interested in her, and I hope you are, you don't have to agree with her, but she lived in the 20th century, so there are various video clips of her. There's some famous kind of interviews with her as well, especially as an older lady. You go and watch half an hour of her talking. Pick out the bits where you feel she's got a point. Pick out the bits where you feel that she's being flawed. She is extreme, in this idea of, she's often kind of challenged on this, especially about the kind of the charity idea. She actually said at one point that altruism is evil, meaning giving to others is evil. And, to clarify, and she clarifies her point in these interviews. She's not saying that, giving to charity is evil, but the expectation that you should or that you have to is wrong, and it causes you to not fulfill yourself because you're so caught up with trying to support others. She argues passionately for the right to property and to income without having a welfare tax. So you can see kind of conservative ideas here, because many conservatives, or all conservatives really, are in favour of kind of property, because it gives you a stake in society and a desire to kind of keep things stable. And here's the one of her many altruism quotes. She said that the morality of altruism that men have to reject. If you can find the clip about her and altruism where she kind of explains her ideas, it's well worth a watch to kind of think through yourself. In my view, and I do try and keep my views out of this, I think she sets up altruism as something that it isn't. Like if you and me were to talk about altruism, we probably just mean kindness. But she kind of says at the beginning of her definition, she says, no, there is a difference between benevolence, which is kind of like love and kindness, and full-on altruism. So she kind of sets up altruism with quite a strict definition of believing that you have to help others. And then she knocks that down and explains why that's bad. But it's a really interesting kind of thought process to go through. So she wants to roll back the state. And if you know your Thatcher and your Reagan, you'll know that especially Thatcher really did. She privatizes so much, gets the state out of the economy. She lets the mines and other businesses go out of business. She doesn't close them, but she doesn't keep them open. And that is an important distinction, because she believes in this kind of free economy. And again, if you know your Thatcher, you'll know that for the first few years of her premiership, this kind of wrecked the northern economy and the kind of the unemployment soared, because suddenly the government was no longer keeping these businesses open. But then it did turn around, especially in the south, and especially in London in particular, where she kind of transformed Britain into being a kind of a manual, industrial nation into kind of like a services nation. She transformed the economy for some, while allowing jobs to die in other areas. But this isn't a video about Thatcher, it's about Ayn Rand, but you can see here. She also believes that the state's role and responsibility should be to defend borders and free markets, and this is kind of like the limits of what they should do. And she believes in the police, and she believes in the armed forces, and that they are necessary to kind of protect ourselves. But this is very different from modern liberalism. It's hugely different from socialism. We are on our own, carving out our own rational self-realization and fulfillment. And this is an interesting topic that I could talk on for quite a long time, but I feel I should, because through our experiences, we meet different people that have kind of played with these kind of ideas and what's kind of ended up. And I want to talk all about them, but I probably shouldn't. So then what do conservatives think about the economy as a whole? If I put all of the different groups together, what do we get? Well, they all believe that property provides security. If you have property, and let's use property to mean house for a minute. If you have a house, you're not going to want to wreck your house or the person's next to yours house or your local community or damage society, because you have what's called a stake in that society. You have something that you want to keep safe. And even if that property is not a house, it's a business, or it's wealth, or it's whatever, it's property being something that you own and you value, you're going to want to keep that safe, which provides security to society as a whole. Because if everyone owns property, or most people own property, most people are going to want to keep those things secure and stable. So one of the ways that conservatives believe that you can provide stability and continuation to a state is to allow people to become property owners, which is where Thatcher allows people that owned council houses to buy their own houses. It was called the right to buy scheme, I think. And to kind of get them into this idea. Property gives a stake in society. There we go. Property reduces state dependency, because if you have property, whether it's a house business, blah, 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 it means that you can be dependent on yourself. You have your own wealth, your own resources to draw upon, so you don't need to be kind of drawing upon the state. Can you feel the kind of the ideology here? You know, this is very much a kind of like, oh, this is how we want things to be. Because in your head here, you might be kind of going, hang on a minute, you know, this doesn't always work. Fine, you know, disagree with it, but this is in many ways a kind of ideology all of its own. And then we get the division here, because traditional and one nation conservatives follow what came to be known as Keynesian economics, or Keynesian economics, or however you want to pronounce it, named after John Maynard Keynes, whereas the neoliberals, or the new right, you can kind of put those terms, explain those terms as you want, believes in a laissez-faire style of economy where you privatize and you curb the power of the unions. So we definitely have a difference here. There's general agreement amongst the top three, and then you get this big disagreement here amongst these bottom two. But these bottom two are big. These bottom two are big. This isn't like a minor disagreement, really. This is a very different wholesale approach to the economy. So let's just put the new right up against traditional and one nation, and you'll probably find in an essay that, broadly speaking, you're going to be saying that traditional and one nation conservatives agree with each other in almost everything, except maybe some approaches to the economy and society, where one nation become a little more kind of enabling, and some kind of approaches to kind of human nature in terms of empathy and things like that. But broadly speaking, traditional and one nation are in agreement, and then new right is nearly always here's the kind of the disagreement. But they do often come from the same core values. Anyway, so in human nature, you get the traditional ones that have a kind of a negative view of human nature. It's skeptical of idealism. You've got the Thomas Hobbes approach, whereas the new right believes that there's rationalism, which can unlock human potential. In our society, the traditional one nation approach is that it should be hierarchical with the ruling class, that you have these kind of traditional little platoons, which I'm not sure I've mentioned in the videos, but it's in the textbook. So look up little platoons if you haven't come across it, but little groups of people living and kind of working together in their little hierarchies. But the new right says, no, the society should be atomistic and with a kind of meritocracy. The state, traditional one nation, we're paternalistic, we've got a ruling class, whereas in the new right, we've got a radical rollback on state dependency and the state doing far, far less. And of course, we've just discussed the economy, where it's nationalistic and Keynesian versus kind of a free market, perhaps with a globalization, I've got a mistake there, a typo there, towards the economy. So we're almost hitting half an hour, but I think I want to get through this last thinker now, because he also illustrates similar ideas to classic liberals and fits in very nicely with Ayn Rand. This is Robert Nozick, and he is an academic living in the 20th century again. There's not very many video clips of him, but he is an academic, so he is more or less a kind of a modern thinker, really. And he's fully on board with the idea of Locke's rationalism. So remember, it's neoliberal. In many ways, this is a development of liberalism more than a type of conservatism, but it's that conservatism becomes neoliberal economically. Oh, and I will just pause here while it occurs to me. Nearly everything I've kind of talked about here is going to be on that neoliberal side, because that's where the kind of the key thinkers are. But don't forget that neoconservative side, which still believes in a strong state, which still believes in traditional family values, and find the bits in your textbooks that explore those ideas, because I'm not really going to be covering it here. He believes in rationalism. He believes in self-ownership, as in taking care of yourself, and the fact that we should all be owners. He uses a nice little phrase here that he believes in a miniaturist government, which is limited to the narrow functions of forced theft and enforcement of contracts. So some people talk about a small government, a large government, an enabling government. He says, I want a miniaturist government. Like he's almost an anarchist in many ways. Like he almost wants no state, no government interference at all. But he accepts or argues that you do need one, but all it should be doing is stopping theft and enforcing contracts between people and businesses. Like he argues that society should function by people and businesses making contracts. I will pay you this if you provide me this service. And all the government should really be doing is enforcing those contracts if someone kind of breaks them, or and stopping people kind of stealing from one another. Really interestingly, you can put Nozick up against Rawls in Modern Liberals, and if you put it, and because they both disagree about justice, and I watched a really interesting video about this the other day, and if you're interested, send me a message and I'll try and link you to it, or find it yourself. Be a good independent learner. They both talk about justice, and they both talk about the theory of justice, and they both talk about or discuss distributive justice. But for Rawls, who's the liberal thinker, modern liberal thinker, he sees justice as enabling everyone to have equal opportunities to enter this liberal kind of marketplace. A modern liberal thinker, enabling state. For him, justice is making sure everyone has the opportunity to compete. Think about his kind of veil of ignorance. What kind of society do you want? You want one where everyone is enabled to carve out the lives that they want through their own skills or hard work and so on. Whereas Nozick sees justice as complete fairness, as in, is it fair to take my money? Is it fair that I have to kind of redistribute my wealth to kind of someone else? Is it fair that someone kind of gives me a free handout? He sees justice very much or kind of like, they both argue like, I was going to say what is right, but actually they would both say that they believe what they're saying is right. But his version of justice is about not taking something that is yours, and he gives an example of a basketball player over and over, and I've just forgotten the name of the basketball player. I'm sure you can find it online if you type in Robert Nozick basketball player, and he gives this example of a famous basketball player at the time. And if people are paying to see that basketball player play, that basketball player will end up rich because of his skills, because of his talent, because he is a draw, because people are willing to give him money to play. So he then kind of says, well, is it then right to say to that basketball player, you've earned that money, now give some of your money to others through tax to enable them to have opportunities, which would go under rules. And Nozick argues, no, clearly not, he says. That this is, if a person owns their money, it is their right to keep it and not have it taken from them and redistributed to others. There's a really good video that covers that one, which is done by, I think it might be Crash Course Philosophy. I think they kind of animate it nicely out. He argues then that the state interference will restrict our freedom. You can see that in the workings of Ayn Rand as well. Taxation is on a par with forced labor. Let's use the extreme examples here. Like, I think if you're very, very wealthy, I think in Britain you have something like a 45% rate of tax or something like that. So you work for a week, half of that week, everything you earn goes to the government. This would be his argument. He would kind of say, it's forced labor. You are forcing someone to work for half of that week to take their money. Of course there are counter arguments. Do people really need that amount of money? Is it right that some people have so much while other people have so few? There are counter arguments. I'm not saying they're not. But when I'm kind of talking about these thinkers, I'm trying to kind of present their view and give the arguments that they would give. Is it right that people work and then their money is taken from them when they have no choice through this thing called tax? I think at one point he even describes taxation as theft. The government is stealing my money to give it to someone else and redistribute. And he says that this is an illegitimate power of the state to enrich some persons at the expense of others. Kind of work your way through that quote. The illegitimate, wrong power of the state, the government, to give some people wealth at the expense of others. Now, of course, what it's actually saying is that these people that are already rich, it's bringing down the rich's wealth to bring up the poor. So you can see what the obvious counter argument would be here, but Nozick is arguing, well, why should the government have the power to take away money to give it to others? Where is the right to get that? And they actually talk a bit about kind of like rights, like why should you take money from one person to give it to the other? Like, where is the right? Why should that kind of happen. Obviously, a socialist would talk about community and rights, responsibility, but for a liberal who believe in self-ownership, meritocracy, blah blah blah, there is, and think of like the atomistic society. If we're all these little atoms separate from each other, taking from one to give to the other, regardless of the wealth inequality, for them is wrong. Interestingly though, Nozik is actually in favor of a liberal permissive society because he is a liberal, really. Whereas the new right as a whole, of course, has these traditional family values that are far more neoconservative, which is why it's a combination. So am I going to go through this here? I'll probably leave this one up here, and I'm not going to talk it through because I think this video is now long enough. But you might want to kind of pause the screen and have a kind of look at it. But some people have kind of said, well, does the new right actually make sense? Like, can you put neoliberalism together with neoconservatism and end up with something that is kind of coherent? And these kind of arrows here suggest that there are contradictions there. But perhaps 10 years of Thatcherism and 10 years of Reaganism would suggest that is not the case. Just as a final thought, so where do you see the new right today? You see it very strongly in American politics under some of Donald Trump's policies, and where the kind of Republican Party is going to come, like the Thatcheristic policies, Reagan postulate policies, kind of went out a bit in the 90s and the early kind of the early noughties, because there was kind of a push towards the left amongst society as a whole. And remember, conservatism moves. Conservatism kind of sways as it needs to. And there was a kind of a feeling that they needed to be more kind of given to the poor, redistributed to the poor, and money put into education and things like that. But there has been a kind of a shift backwards, where David Cameron in the UK, when he did the kind of austerity things, and perhaps under kind of Trump, where he was talking about pulling back on the state, kind of anti-reaction against the Obama kind of welfare state approach and things like that. These kind of policies are still around. But using Cameron as an example, of course, Cameron was perhaps neoliberal economically, but he wasn't really neoconservative for traditional family values, because he brought in kind of gay marriage and things like that. So have a think and a discussion with your teacher in class, or amongst your kind of fellow students, is to what extent do you still see the new right as a whole in modern day politics? I think I would argue that you see some threads very strongly, perhaps maybe the economic take care of yourself threads. Social side has, I would argue, perhaps has slowly been kind of eaten away at as society as a whole has generally become more liberal. But you do still see it, for example, like it's 2021 when I'm recording this video. There's a big debate going on at the moment about kind of like trans rights and things like that. And you can still see that the parties on the left, like Labour, are talking about these issues far more than the Conservative Party. So you can still feel that the Conservatives are still more traditional in their values, and what tends to happen is other parties kind of pull forward socially, and then the kind of Conservatives kind of come along slowly. And again, that's not a criticism, it's an observation that they tend to perhaps deliberately lag behind and be more in favor of kind of traditional values and traditional approaches. And again, of course, the abortion debate going on in America would be another key example of that. Right, thank you for watching. Sorry that was a little bit long, but you know what? It was full of loads of great information, so I'm not sorry. You just got better at your A-level because you've watched it. If you liked the video, then don't forget to like it, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you when we start to look at socialism. All the best. See you soon. Bye-bye.